I built myself a custom workstation using scrap wood and epoxy, and finished it with UV cured hard wax oil without spending $700 on a light. I worked up this design in Fusion 360. I decided to start with the cabinet, which will hold the computer tower in the back. I left the sides open here to improve airflow and help keep the PC cool. A few months ago, I built this bar top for a client. It came from this beautifully figured slab of walnut, specifically this section right here, which left me with some oddly sized cutoffs. For the sides of the cabinet, I decided to repurpose this section. The slab was 2 inches thick, so I figured I could resaw it and hopefully end up with some 3/4 inch book matched boards that I could then glue up into panels for the sides. My bandsaw has a 13-inch resaw capacity, so I ripped the large pieces into boards that were just under 13 inches wide. Once I had them cut to a manageable size, I needed to establish a flat face that could reference against the bandsaw fence. So for boards this wide, the jointer wasn't an option, so out came the planer sled. Some double-sided tape, shims, and CA glue secured everything in place for a few passes through the planer. I then squared up one edge on the jointer to keep everything true while resawing at the bandsaw. Once I had the stock milled for the sides and the back, I turned my attention to the top and front, which I wanted to have a continuous grain pattern. To achieve this, I took this cutoff because it was long enough that I could get 2 drawer fronts and the top out of it, all with continuous grain. My bandsaw is only 1 3/4 horsepower and wired for 110, so I really was maxing it out with this cut. But the resaw King blade did all the heavy lifting. All I had to do was control my feed rate. Now I had 2 nicely book-matched boards that I could use for the cabinet top and the drawer fronts. A few light passes on the planer removed the bandsaw marks and got them to equal thickness. After squaring up all the edges and faces on the cabinet stock, I cleaned them up with a hand plane. I used my number 5.5 jack for this to prep them for glue up. The domino makes quick work of panel alignment, but something like biscuits or splines would be just as effective here. I recently started using Type on Dark anytime I'm gluing up walnut. It really helps make those joint lines completely disappear. I was able to stretch my limited supply of parallel clamps by putting multiple panels next to each other within a single clamp. Once the panels were dry, it was time to assemble the case. I again used dominoes for this, but any other method of alignment would do. I know a lot of people love to hate on sanding, but I actually don't mind it. Now, you may be thinking, yeah, that's easy for you to say. You've got a $600 sander. And that's absolutely a fair point. But I've had cheap ones before this, and even then, I don't know, there's just something about getting to that 180 or 220 grit where you really start to get a sense for what the final product is going to look and feel like. Water popping isn't something I do routinely, but with highly figured boards, it can enhance the visual depth of all those grain patterns. Since this was for me and not a client, I figured it would be a great project to try out this UV cured hard wax oil from Vesting. I actually heard about this stuff from Cam over at Blacktail Studio. He's selling it through his website now, so I ordered some. I was originally going to put it out in the sun to cure, since the lights they recommend start at about $700. But a couple of days later, I thought, screw it, I'll just pony up the cash. I don't want to be waiting on the weather. I mean, the whole point of this stuff is that you can cut your finishing time down significantly. Anyway, when I went back to buy the light, it was sold out at the time. So I did some searching on Amazon and I found this, the UV Beast V2. It was $40 and had far more UV irradiance than anything else I could find. Without getting too technical, the relevant measure is lux, or luminous flux, which describes the amount of light within a certain area. The UV Beast V2 has 4,500 microwatts per square centimeter when held at a distance of 2 feet. Now, I wasn't able to find the exact specs on the expensive recommended light, so I can't compare them directly. However, a little empirical testing proved that this light is certainly strong enough to instantly cure the oil, at least enough that it's dry to the touch. The only question is whether or not it is truly 100% cured. That would matter if, for instance, you wanted to apply a ceramic coating, which requires that whatever finish is underneath it be completely cured. But at the very least, this flashlight will speed the curing process along by doing the bulk of it instantly. I'll be reaching out to Vesting to get their input, but if anyone knows how to test the curedness of a finish, let me know in the comments. Once the casework was done, I turned my attention to the top. A few months back, I made this pirate-themed bar top for a local guy that I guess really likes pirates? I don't know, but I used hard maple, and after ripping the slabs to width, I was left with these two live edge cutoffs. I've been moving away from doing straight-up river tables as of late, but these two pieces were tailor-made for that. And by tailor-made, I mean I just couldn't think of another way to use them, so we're doing a river tabletop. There's already a ton of videos on how to build a mold, so I won't cover that here. Though I will mention that I no longer use Tyvek tape. Instead, I just apply this mold release. It's faster, and in my experience, provides a much cleaner release when it comes time to break things down. I was going for a mostly transparent, but not quite glass-like effect, like a very lightly frosted glass. I could have done this in one pour with just the casting resin, but I was in my basement instead of the garage, and I was a bit paranoid about getting a leak. So I did a thin pour using tabletop epoxy and followed it up with the deep pour formula. I mentioned earlier that I don't hate sanding. I do, however, absolutely despise this next step, flattening with a router sled. It's kind of a pain to set it up accurately, and it makes your shop look like Times Square after the ball drops. There's really just no good way to collect all those shavings, and even if you could, they'd fill up your dustbin in record time. Once both sides were flat, I cleaned up all the edges with the track saw and cut to final width and final length. I put a 30-degree chamfer on the front edge to make it a bit more comfortable when sitting at the desk for long periods. I found this brass bar on Amazon to hold the panel mounts for the integrated power, USB, and HDMI ports. Then I used the shaper origin to add a 1/4 inch radius to the corners. Since the shaper stored the exact shape and dimensions of the brass bar I had just cut, I could cut on the inside of that same line to create a recess in the tabletop. Then I used double stick tape to temporarily secure the brass bar in the recess, providing a flush surface for the shaper when cutting out the holes for all of the panel mounts. This was my first time cutting brass with a router. It was a bit tricky to get the feed rates dialed in, but with some practice and a few broken bits later, I was in business. I was going for something between a brushed and a polished finish, so I hit it with 180 and 240 to start. Once I got to 320, I wet sanded with CRC metal lubricant. And then I repeated the process with 800 grit Abranet. Now that all the rough cutting was done, I could start finish sanding. I started with 120 and went over the entire top. When you're sanding epoxy, it's really important to blow off all the leftover debris with compressed air, and then follow that up with either isopropyl alcohol or water. This ensures that debris left over from the previous grit doesn't work its way into the next grit and cause additional scratches. 240 is the last grit that I'll be using on the entire top. After that, I'll only be hitting the epoxy itself. Now, there will definitely be some spillover at the edges where the epoxy meets the wood, but we'll go back and clean that up after. At this point, I'll only be wet sanding, starting out with 320. Continuing to remove all the debris between grits, I then move on to 800. And finally 1500. If I was trying to get this to look completely transparent, I'd go higher. To give the epoxy a nice sheen, we'll move on to 3M's Perfected system. I'll buff on the step 1 compound using a wool pad. After wiping off all the residue from step 1, it's time to move on to step 2, which is applied with a gray pad. And again, since I'm not going for a glass-like finish, I won't bother with step 3 of the polishing compound. At this point, I have to go back with 240 grit on the random orbital sander to touch up the edges of the wood that were contaminated by those higher grits and polishing compounds. Before putting finish on the top, I wanted to attach the brass posts, which would connect the top to the cabinet and left leg. I bought 2 6-inch long pieces and cut them in half with a hacksaw. I sanded these using the same method as I did for the brass panel before permanently securing them to the tabletop with some 4-minute epoxy. I decided to apply the LED oil to the entire top rather than just the wood sections. The oil will introduce some haziness to the epoxy, so if you're going for that glass-like effect, you should only do the wood portions. I like to hold the flashlight about 2 to 3 inches from the surface and move at about 2 inches per second in one direction, followed by a second pass in the opposite direction. This is just a little insurance in case I missed a spot on the first pass. This strategy takes about 7 minutes per side for a top this size. One of the perks of an instantly curing oil is that you don't need to worry about smudging the finish after flipping it over to do the next side. I still do the bottom side first, mostly out of habit, but it's definitely not required. Since I had such a good experience with this light, I actually ordered another version, the V3, which is also made by UV Beast. This one has an even stronger UV irradiance, coming in at 8100 microwatts per square centimeter, again when held at a distance of 2 feet. That's almost twice as strong as the V2, which I'm using here, and at a price of $60, it's only $20 more than the V2. Supposedly, the cone of light is more focused on the V3, which is why I opted for the V2 initially. I'll be testing out the V3 and sharing my results here, so if you'd like to see that, or if you've enjoyed this video so far and want to see more builds like it, please subscribe to the channel. Now, onto the leg. To be honest, I have no idea what project these scraps came from, but I knew they were maple and they matched the maple on the top reasonably well. This was 5/4 stock, so I knew I'd have to do some face glue ups to get the thickness around 1.5 inches, which would match the thickness of the top. I ripped them down to 6 inches so they would fit on my jointer and squared up all 4 sides. Then I glued up the 3/4 inch pieces and then glued those to one another for a final width that matched the top. I used the Rotex sander to remove any rough spots at the joints, cut it to final height, and routed out some mortises on the top to accept the brass posts. This project was kind of a hat trick for me. I was able to clear out some space in the shop, recycle a bunch of cutoffs, and treat myself to an upgraded workstation. I'll be spending a lot more time here as I film, edit, and share all of my upcoming projects, so if you've enjoyed this one, I'd really appreciate your subscription. I've also provided affiliate links to many of the tools used in this build, so check those out if you're interested. Until next time, I'm Mike, and I'll see you on the next one.